Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Yesterday, we were looking at the Colosseum, and we were talking about how the Flavian dynasty, so Vespasian, how him and his family tried to make the populace happy and content. And so they built some building projects. And so we were on the Colosseum. So in your note takers, if you could go back to note taker 44 for a Colosseum. I had mentioned yesterday that you had easy access into the Colosseum. You would have a ticket and it would have a number on it, and then you would know which entrance that you would want to enter, right? And as you walked in through your entrance, you kind of can see from this illustration that you'd basically have these aisles. And these aisles were made into barrel vaults. So can you see how this hall has arches that are kind of, one after the other, sort of creates like a tunnel effect. And that would be like an aisle for you. And then where two of these barrel vaults intersect, right, wherever there would be an intersection, we have what we call a groin vault. And so you can see that they kind of come together in a point in the center. And then that would be like, oh, I go straight, I go to the left, I go to the right. And then there was a series of ramps as well. So it was very easy for you to get to your different levels, right? So this is where we ended off yesterday. The very bottom of it, the arena itself was covered in sand. And sand is really great because it absorbs a lot of blood, okay? So not just blood of gladiators, but animals. They would have ceremonial hunts and they'd have spectacle with exotic animals from all around the empire. Of course, there was gladiators. The persecution of Christians did not happen as much as the lore would suggest. They basically would bring people from distant lands, others in general, any other religions and people, and they would, if they were not Romans, they might become gladiators or enslaved people that could be part of the spectacle, okay? Another thing that they were able to do, which was really kind of cool, is that they could also flood the arena. So they would recreate important battles in naval history, and they'd bring ships and they'd have pulleys that they could move props. It's almost like theater, and they could have different things going on. So it wasn't just athletic events, or gladiatorial events, but also recreations of naval battles on that floor. So if you were an important official, where do you think you sat? By looking at this graphic. Yeah, at the bottom. So the emperor had special seating, people in power had special seating. And so if you were an upper class, you were close, you could probably smell the blood, right? And then citizens would be in the middle, enslaved people and women would be standing at the top. So notice enslaved people and women. Women had very little social status in ancient Rome. Probably the wives of important people maybe got to sit down here, but common women were up at the top in standing room only. Okay, so you can see that in this example, right? So we have our high officials, important officials, citizens and soldiers, and then women and slaves at the top. Here you can see a little bit of the elevation as well, how they would stack those arches. And of course, all that construction is made out of concrete. Okay. Oh, here's an illustration of the sea battles. Isn't that kind of cool? Okay. And then one of the other things to notice, and I have a video that you can watch too, is that they would have, like at the height of the Colosseum, we have 365 days in a year, 265 or 280 days. They actually would have something going on in the Colosseum. It was a busy place. It was a very busy place. And if you've ever been to the Mediterranean in the summer, it gets quite hot. The sun is very potent. So one of the things that they could do is they could cover the roof of the Colosseum. They basically used canvas and a pulley system. And then they had the people in the Navy. They had a rigging system where they could pull it and shut it to block out any rain or that hot sun. So they could enclose the structure, just like some of the like football stadiums that we have today, right? Soccer or football stadiums with roofs. Okay. And then we also mentioned that in the floor, this is where they could have trap doors that open to let lions in. If you've ever seen the old movie Gladiator, you can see that happening and illustrating in that movie. There was tunnels. So basically this was covered in the floor and sand. And so you really couldn't see what was going on underneath of it. But you'd have gladiators, wild animals, props, and all the kinds of things that you would need for the shows kind of hidden underneath the floor. Okay. So any questions on the Colosseum? So it's made out of concrete, covered in travertine or covered in stone. I think that's what they call it there. Today, it really is just a shell of what it once was, right? You can see some of that restoration to kind of give us an idea of what it once looked like. Okay, so this is the Arch of Titus, which is in the Forum, and it's not in the 250, but I wanted to make sure that we understood that there was a lot of celebration of rulers as well as conquests. So the Arch of Titus was placed back in the Forum. We're not sure if this is exactly the right location for it, but this is really a very common monument to the glory of Rome. It's not a building, even though it has architectural elements to it, just like the column of Trajan, it's decorative. And so it's this triumphant arch that would be on the roadway. So when the armies returned to ancient Rome, they could march through the center arch in like triumphant spectacle. And so at the very top, we have our dedication that was donated by the Senate because of the conquest of Titus and the Roman army. And as you walk through, you see that there are a coifred ceiling. So the top of the arch has these little squares. We'll see that at the Pantheon in just a few moments. This is a very similar decorative motif that we see in lots of temples of the day. It's a little rosette in center of it, so little flower designs. And then on the wall, we have the raiding of the Temple of Solomon. So Titus conquered Jerusalem and raided the Jewish temple. And so when we look at it, we can see the spoils that they stole when they destroyed that temple, that Jewish shrine. And you can see the menorah here. You can see the soldiers walking through. And if you look really carefully in the background, you see a little atmospheric perspective. So hazier, less detail, and they're walking through a triumphant arch, right? And so you can see that this is on one side, and then the other side has an image of Titus on a chariot as he is walking through with his soldiers. So all of this stuff is all propaganda to show the glory of ancient Rome and to emphasize the worthiness of the ruler and his armies, right? And make sure that we understand that he conquered the Jews, right? This is not keeping anyone happy, but these are some really cool Flavian dynasty portrait busts. This is a really good example of the kind of care and attention they took when carving portrait busts, not only of men, which we've seen, but also of women. So this is a very common hairstyle that we see with the women of the day. This is like a young Flavian woman. And so they would braid their hair and wrap it in fabric. And then they'd spend lots of time with curling irons, curling to a perfect corkscrew curl. Now, the reason this is important in sculpture is that they created something we call chisel and drill. So they were able to use a very fine chisel and a drill to make negative space on the curls. So there are some channels. They might not be fully like go all the way through, but they were able to drill out negative space for added realism, right? And so this is in the museum on Capitoline Hill. That's where City Hall is in Rome today. That's where that Jupiter Maximus temple once stood. Here's an older Flavian woman. You see the realism didn't disappear, but she too has a very similar hairstyle. Okay. So we're going to move into Roman temple architecture, focusing on functionalism as well as symbolism. So we're going to look at some sacred spaces. Now, this is a very modest temple that sits at the top of the forum. This is a temple of Fortunas, or it has another name as well. But this is pretty standard what these Roman temples look like. So it was on a raised podium, right? It was elevated. It had a staircase, right? So you had a entranceway in, and then it would have a cella. And so in ancient Rome, in the cella, you once again might have a sculpture dedicated to the god. You might have spoils of war, treasury materials as well. Now this one has a porch. And what kind of columns does it have? Ionic. But remember that the Romans kind of do it their way. There's not a lot of relief sculpture here. And it even has little dentils. So they would kind of do whatever they wanted for the style. Some of them are engaged. Some of them are kind of in the wall. Or so these are freestanding, these are engaged. So engaged is when they're embedded into the wall. So it's more like a structural, a decorative element rather than structural, right? Those columns are not holding anything up because it's in a solid stone wall. Instead, it just creates that sense of harmony and repetition that we see on the front porch, right? That sense of symmetry. This one is in Nimes, France, and so we can see a better example of how they're elevated, right? So if you were going to look at the similarities and differences of the types of temples we have the Pantheon, right? We have the Temple of Vesta of Etruscan, and then we have this one. What are some of the similar features? Go ahead, talk to each other. What are similar about them? Okay, any similarities between all three? Any similarities between all three? Yeah. They all have columns, and so those are the little circular dots. That's a really great thing because we will see so many plans, and they could even throw in a plan that we've never seen before because they want you to understand it by looking at something else we have studied. So knowing that those circles or columns is a good thing to know. I like that. So they all have columns and structure and decoration. What else? Any other similarities? Yeah. They all have some sort of porch. So the Etruscans and the Romans typically have a porch on the front, which is kind of typical of like houses, right? And then the Parthenon had porch in the front and the back, so that's a slight difference. And they all have cellas. So we would have kind of a fortified, see how the walls are a little bit thick, a protective element that would be in that sacred, the most sacred spot of the actual temple, right? typically have that comes in a central location. Yeah. Right. So they typically have one main entrance, and that what I would even say is typical of the Parthenon too. But the Parthenon does have the additional with that treasury in the back. And so you could get into it from any side of the temple and any two doorways. But with the Etruscans and Romans, there's only one way to get up into the temple, which is another thing. They're all elevated because things that are important are raised, right? They're not on a sacred mountain, but they are elevated to show their importance. Now that's important because when you go to the Pantheon, which we're going to go to next, it's not raised anymore, but it used to be. It just ancient medieval city kind of grew up around it, and so now it's not elevated anymore. Okay, there it is, which leads us, I guess, to the Pantheon. So this is the Pantheon. We're in image number 46 Pantheon, Imperial Rome. It is concrete with stone facing. It also has a lot of marble on the inside of it, but for some reason, they didn't include that in the media either. And so it's a little bit different than our standard temple. It does have a porch or a portico with a pediment top to it, but instead of having a rectilinear temple, it has a rotunda. So it has a round space in the back, and that is big part of it is based on its function. So I'll put that back. So as you guys are kind of jotting around this, I will definitely say, and like little hint. This is definitely one of my favorite buildings of ancient Rome. Probably because it's really well preserved. And it was really well preserved because it was converted to a church, just like so many other ancient temples. But it is really impressive on the inside. And so before we leave today, even though it's a little dated, the video goes back to the 80s, I'm going to show you how big the interior is and how impressive that interior space is. So for the Pantheon, we have an exterior image and then we have an interior image. Okay, so a little bit of context. It has an inscription at the top that makes us think that it was from the time of Agrippa, but it is not from Agrippa. It was actually made during the reign of Hadrian and completed during the reign of Trajan. So Hadrian is the emperor who expanded the territory to its greatest area. So this is like the height of the empire, okay? Trajan, who we see with our column of Trajan, it started to shrink a little bit by the time he was in power, okay? Now, the inscription that's at the top, he lived in the 1st century BCE. So this is a CE building. There probably once was a temple here, just like at the Acropolis, how there had been an earlier set of temples dedicated to Amphitheater. There was probably an earlier version of the Pantheon, but it was destroyed and rebuilt by Hadrian. And so the date on it or the inscription on the top doesn't really tell us a lot. We know it's from the time of Hadrian because in this barrel rotunda that you see right here, there are stamped bricks. And you can see it when you walk around the structure. It has the date and it tells us that it was done during the reign of Hadrian and Trajan. Now, the last bit about this context is that when you look at the interior, you'll see that there's all different colors of beautiful marble on the inside. And then the columns themselves are single pieces of granite. All of that content or material came from all the different regions of the empire. So the granite actually came from Egypt. They were brought, those big long pieces of granite were brought up the Nile and then shipped across the Mediterranean and brought to Rome. And then the marble came from different elements or different places of the empire. Okay, so I think, did you guys all watch the Pantheon video? I know it's been busy. Okay, let's go ahead and watch the Pantheon video. I'm not going to break us into groups, but let's look at how one is supposed to experience the Pantheon, how it functions, how the decoration is unique, and how the construction is innovative. So maybe it would make sense for me to block us into groups, but I don't think we'll have. There's a big Okay, so pretty complex structure. I spent a summer in Rome studying. Every week we did something different. And once I went to the Pantheon, I went there like literally every day. It is that amazing of a structure. I would sit underneath those big giant columns at night and listen to violins play in the courtyard in the front and eat pizza. It was just an amazing, amazing place. So it's gorgeous on the inside and kind of on the outside. So keep in mind that what we see today is very different. It was a surprise. When you were in this courtyard, you went through like a triumphant arch, you go up some stairs, and all you could really see is the temple front and these massive bronze doors. Colossal bronze doors were very common in ancient Rome in the front of some of these temples. And of course, most of them are gone today because what happens with bronze stuff? We melt it and make it into something else, right? And so this has original large bronze doors. And you see those big granite columns as you enter in. You really don't understand how deep the porch is if you were experiencing it from the front, right? But it's very deep and it hides the depth of that porch, hides from your peripheral that rotunda. So you would not be able to really get a grasp of what that interior space would look like if you've never been inside before, right? So you'll walk through those doors and what you'll be is encompassed by a larger than life interior space, right? Ancient Greeks, the height of their pomp and circumstance when it came to religion happened outside, but the I in merit stands for interiors. And so the Romans really loved to do up the interiors of their spaces, not only in, you know, the grandiose scale, but also in the decoration. So they spent a lot of time talking about all that different colored marble, right? The columns, the niches, the fake windows, the niches, and then of course that coifred ceiling. It is very over the top in its decoration. Oh. I guess we'll continue with this next time. Have a great weekend. Enjoy homecoming.